and I am very happy, my dear. No one has such friends as I," continued she, taking my hand and holding it in hers. If I had never known of Mr. Holbrook, I could have said something in this pause, but as I had, I could not think of anything that would come in naturally, and so we both kept silent for a little time. "My father once made us," she began, "keep a diary in 2 columns. On one side, we were to put down in the morning what we thought would be the course and events of the coming day, and at night we were to put down on the other side what really had happened. It would be to some people rather a sad way of telling their lives." A tear dropped upon my hand at these words. I don't mean that mine has been sad, only so very different to what I expected. I remember one winter's evening, sitting over our bedroom fire with Deborah. I remember it as if it were yesterday, and we were planning our future lives. Both of us were planning, though only she talked about it. She said she would like to marry an archdeacon and write his charges, and you know, my dear, she never was married, and, for aught I know, she never spoke to an unmarried archdeacon in her life. I never was ambitious, nor could I have written charges, but I thought I could manage a house. My mother used to call me her right hand, and I was always so fond of little children. The shyest babies would stretch out their little arms to come to me. When I was a girl, I was half my leisure time nursing in the neighboring cottages, but I don't know how it was when I grew sad and grave, which I did a year or 2 after this time. The little things drew back from me, and I am afraid I lost the knack, though I am just as fond of children as ever, and have a strange yearning at my heart whenever I see a mother with her baby in her arms. Nay, my dear, and by a sudden blaze which sprung up from a fall of the unstirred coals, I saw that her eyes were full of tears, gazing intently on some vision of what might have been. Do you know, I dream sometimes that I have a little child, always the same, a little girl of about 2 years old. She never grows older, though I have dreamt about her for many years. I don't think I ever dream of any words or sound she makes. She's very noiseless and still, but she comes to me when she is very sorry or very glad, and I have wakened with the clasp of her dear little arms round my neck. Only last night, perhaps because I have gone to sleep thinking of this ball for Phoebe, my little darling came in my dream and put up her mouth to be kissed, just as I have seen real babies do to real mothers before going to bed. But all this is nonsense, dear. Only don't be frightened by Miss Pole from being married. I can fancy it may be a very happy state, and a little credulity helps one on through life very smoothly, better than always doubting and seeing difficulties and disagreeables in everything. If I had been inclined to be daunted from matrimony, it would not have been Miss Pole to do it. It would have been the lot of poor Signor Bernoni and his wife, and yet again, it was an encouragement to see how, through all their cares and sorrows, they thought of each other and not of themselves, and how keen were their joys if they only passed through each other, or through the little Phoebe. The Signora told me one day a good deal about their lives up to this period. It began by my asking her whether Miss Pole's story of the twin brothers were true. It sounded so wonderful a likeness that I should have had my doubts if Miss Pole had not been unmarried. But the Signora, or as we found out she preferred to be called, Miss Brown, said it was quite true, that her brother-in-law was by many taken for her husband, which was of great assistance to them in their profession, though, she continued, how people can mistake Thomas for the real Signor Bernoni, I can't conceive, but he says they do, so I suppose I must believe him. Not but what he is a very good man. I am sure I don't know how we should have paid our bill at the Rising Sun, but for the money he sends. But people must know very little about art if they can take him for my husband. Why, miss, in the ball trick, where my husband spreads his fingers wide and throws out his little finger with quite an air and a grace, Thomas just clumps up his hand like a fist, and might have ever so many balls hidden in it. Besides, he has never been in India, and knows nothing of the proper sit of a turban. Have you been in India? Said I, rather astonished. Oh, yes, many a year, ma'am. Sam was a sergeant in the 31st. and when the regiment was ordered to India, I drew a lot to go, and I was more thankful than I can tell, for it seemed as if it would only be a slow death to me to part from my husband. But, indeed, ma'am, if I had known all, I don't know whether I would not rather have died there and then than gone through what I have done since. To be sure, I've been able to comfort Sam and to be with him. But, ma'am, I've lost 6 children, said she, looking up at me with those strange eyes that I've never noticed but in mothers of dead children, with a kind of wild look in them, as if seeking for what they never more might find. Yes, 6 children died off like little buds nipped untimely in that cruel India. I thought as each died, I never could, I never would, love a child again. And when the next came, it had not only its own love, but the deeper love that came from the thought of its little dead brothers and sisters. And when Phoebe was coming, I said to my husband, Sam, when this child is born, and I am strong, I shall leave you. It will cut my heart cruel, but if this baby dies too, I shall go mad. The madness in me now, but if you let me go down to Calcutta, carrying my baby step by step, it will maybe work itself off, and I will save, and I will hoard, and I will beg, and I will die to get a passage home to England where our baby may live. God bless him. He said I might go, and he saved up his pay, and I saved every pice I could get for washing or any way. And when Phoebe came and I grew strong again, I set off. It was very lonely, through the thick forest, dark again with their heavy trees, along by the river's side. But I had been brought up near the Avon in Warwickshire, so that flowing noise sounded like home. From station to station, from Indian village to village, I went along, carrying my child. I seen one of the officers' ladies with a little picture, ma'am, done by a Catholic foreigner, ma'am, of the Virgin and the little Savior, ma'am. She had him on her arm, and her form was softly curled round him, and their cheeks touched. Well, when I went to bid good-bye to this lady, for whom I had washed, she cried sadly, for she too had lost her children. But she had not another to save like me, and I was bold enough to ask her would she give me that print. And she cried the more, and said her children were with that little blessed Jesus, and gave it to me, and told me that she had heard it had been painted on the bottom of a cask, which made it have that round shape. And when my body was very weary, and my heart was sick, for there were times when I misdoubted if I could ever reach my home, and there were times when I thought of my husband, and one time when I thought my baby was dying, I took out that picture and looked at it, till I could have thought the mother spoke to me and comforted me. And the natives were very kind. We could not understand one another, but they saw my baby on my breast, and they came out to me, and brought me rice and milk, and sometimes flowers. I've got some of the flowers dried. Then, the next morning, I was so tired, and they wanted me to stay with them, I could tell that, and tried to frighten me from going into the deep woods, which, indeed, looked very strange and dark. But it seemed to me as if death was following me to take my baby away from me, and as if I must go on. And I thought how God had cared for mothers ever since the world was made, and would care for me. So I bade them goodbye and set off afresh. And once when my baby was ill, and both she and I needed rest, he led me to a place where I found a kind Englishman lived, right in the midst of the natives. And you reached Calcutta safely at last? Yes, safely. Oh, when I knew I had only 2 days' journey more before me, I could not help it, ma'am. It might be idolatry, I cannot tell, but I was near one of the native temples, and I went into it with my baby to thank God for his great mercy, for it seemed to me that where others had prayed before to their God, in their joy or in their agony, was of itself a sacred place, and I got as servant to an invalid lady, who grew quite fond of my baby aboard ship, and in 2 years' time Sam earned his discharge and came home to me and to our child. Then he had to fix on a trade, but he knew of none, and once upon a time he had learnt some tricks from an Indian juggler. So he set up conjuring, and it answered so well that he took Thomas to help him, as his man, you know, not as another conjurer, though Thomas has set it up now on his own hook. But it has been a great help to us, that likeness between the twins, and made a good many tricks go off well that they made up together. And Thomas is a good brother, only he has not the fine carriage of my husband, so that I cannot think how he can be taken for Signor Bernoni himself, as he says he is. Poor little Phoebe, said I, my thoughts going back to the baby she carried all those 100 miles. Ah, you may say so. I never thought I should have reared her when she fell ill at Chunderabaddad, but that good, kind Aga Jenkyns took us in, which I believe was the very saving of her. Jenkyns, said I. Yes, Jenkyns. I shall think all people of that name are kind, for here is that nice old lady who comes every day to take Phoebe a walk. But an idea had flashed through my head. Could the Aga Jenkyns be the lost Peter? True, he was reported by many to be dead, but equally true, some had said that he had arrived at the dignity of Great Lama of Tibet. Miss Matty thought he was alive. I would make further inquiry. Chapter 12. Engaged to be married. Was the poor Peter of Cranford the Aga Jenkyns of Chunderabaddad, or was he not? As somebody says, that was the question. In my own home, whenever people had nothing else to do, they blamed me for want of discretion. Indiscretion was my bugbear fault. Everybody has a bugbear fault, a sort of standing characteristic, a piece de resistance for their friends to cut at. And in general, they cut and come again. I was tired of being called indiscreet and incautious, and I determined for once to prove myself a model of prudence and wisdom. I would not even hint my suspicions respecting the Aga. I would collect evidence and carry it home to lay before my father as the family friend of the two Miss Jenkynses. In my search after facts, I was often reminded of a description my father had once given of a ladies' committee that he had had to preside over. He said he could not help thinking of a passage in Dickens which spoke of a chorus in which every man took the tune he knew best and sang it to his own satisfaction. So at this charitable committee, every lady took the subject uppermost in her mind and talked about it to her own great contentment, but not much to that advancement of the subject that they had met to discuss. But even that committee could have been nothing to the Cranford ladies when I attempted to gain some clear and definite information as to the poor Peter's height, appearance, and when and where he was seen and heard of last. For instance, I remember asking Miss Pole, and I thought the question was very opportune, for I put it when I met her at a call at Miss Forrester's, and both the ladies had known Peter, and I imagined that they might refresh each other's memories. I asked Miss Pole what was the very last thing they had ever heard about him, and then she named the absurd report to which I have alluded, about his having been elected Great Lama of Tibet, and this was a signal for each lady to go off on her separate idea. Miss Forrester's start was made on the veiled prophet in Lalla Rookh. Whether I thought he was meant for the Great Lama, though Peter was not so ugly, indeed rather handsome, if he had not been freckled, I was thankful to see her double upon Peter, but in a moment the delusive lady was off upon Roland's Cawdor, and the merits of cosmetics and hair oils in general, and holding forth so fluently that I turned to listen to Miss Pole, who, through the llamas, the beast of burden, had got to Peruvian bonds and the share market, and her poor opinion of joint stock banks in general, and of that one in particular in which Miss Matty's money was invested. In vain I put in, when was it? In what year was it that you heard that Mr. Peter was the great Lama? They only joined issue to dispute whether llamas were carnivorous animals or not, in which dispute they were not quite on fair grounds, as Miss Forrester, after they had grown warm and cool again, acknowledged that she always confused carnivorous and graminivorous together, just as she did horizontal and perpendicular. But then she apologized for it very prettily, by saying that in her day the only use people made of four-syllable words was to teach how they should be spelt. The only fact I gained from this conversation was that certainly Peter had last been heard of in India, or that neighborhood, and that the scanty intelligence of his whereabouts had reached Cranford